Hi, Misha here, and I had an opportunity to show you another Enfield. In fact, the last Enfield, at least meant for standard general infantry issue. So today, you've already read the video title. You know we're going to talk about the No. 4 Mark II, which is actually a family of guns. You have the No. 4 Mark II itself, the No. 4 Mark I, like Roman numeral 1/2, and the Mark I/3. These are all very closely related, and they were all manufactured or remanufactured between 1949 and 1955 in the UK. And I relatively recently put out a video on the No. 5 Mark I carbine, aka the Enfield Jungle Carbine. Some of what I said in that will be relevant here. But hey, we have a really nice example here that you have not borne witness to before. This is an extremely late production Mark II from 1955 from the Mishaco facility, which was the only producer of these. And when this came into the USA, it was unissued. Brand new as far as that goes. As brand new as a 50-year-old thing can be. And in several videos in the past, you've seen this gun here. This is older in multiple ways, including the gun itself and the fact that I've had it a while. This is a No. 4 Mark I/2. This actually started off life being produced in England during World War II and then was updated to the Mark II standard. And there are a few differences between the original No. 4 Mark I and Mark II. And there is some history here. But above all, these are just really well-made guns, really attractive guns. Great shooters, because usually they have mint bores. And at one time, believe it or not, they were very inexpensive and easy to find. Some of these, especially ones dated 1954 and 1955, look like they were built or remanufactured and then put immediately into long-term storage. And that's how they came into the USA. They were declared surplus in the 70s or 80s and sold off to importers like Inner Arms and Century Arms, who brought them over. And some like this one came over mummy wrapped, which was kind of this brownish paper with a boatload of Cosmoline. But of course the importer actually did have to open the wrap a little bit to at least check the serial number, so there really shouldn't be a 100% mummy wrapped gun. Plus they of course had to apply some type of import marking post 1968 per the Gun Control Act. And you could pick these up for little or nothing. I remember going into gun shows and seeing them for anywhere from $100 to $150. But to be fair, that seemed like a lot of money at that time for surplus, because the 1990s and the early 2000s, surplus was everywhere. Not just Enfields, but Kar 98s out of Germany, other Mausers such as the Czechoslovakian, Mosins galore, not just Russian, but Polish, Hungarian, Romanian. Even a lot of Chinese guns were around, still. Yeah, it was a good time. But Enfields were right there. So with that, yeah, let's just kind of talk about what we have here and point out some small differences and updates that may have gone unnoticed. England took a long time to finally introduce the number 4, based on lessons from the P-14 and World War I in general. Testing lasted, really if you want to count the Mark V, all the way up from 1920 to 1939. And the big deal was the rear sight. It also had a free-floated barrel, and they wanted to speed up for mass production. And it really wouldn't go into service and be fully and officially adopted until 1941, by which time England was, in war. Now, up to this point, they were using walnut for their Enfields, but for logistical reasons, they wanted to go to birch, beech, other woods, and they didn't have time to let the wood cure, dry out naturally, so they went for accelerated artificial means, kilns mostly. But of course, during the war, they had to simplify things. So we had artificially dried birch wood, and we had to get rid of the fancy brass butt plate. We went to a few different ones were used, steel or Zimac, kind of an alloy. We also went to more and more stamped parts, such as on this British example here for the rear sight. They would eventually go to stamped trigger guards as well. And this one actually still has the early style here for the lug. And it still has the... I totally screwed that up. I'm going to start over. The original SMLE, the Smelly, Mark III of World War I fame, took a long time to get replaced. But work began as early as 1920 with the Smelly Mark V, which led into the number 1 Mark VI in the 1930s, and finally this became the number 4 Mark I in 1939, officially entering into production and service in 1941. But Britain, well, they were in the throes of war. Now, older Enfields used walnut stalks furniture, and the wood was allowed to cure, dry out naturally. For various logistical reasons, and because they really needed to build a bunch of them, they looked into artificial ways of curing and accelerating the whole process to get more wood faster. Think of it as a Viagra for the guns. They used kilns mostly, and they used birch wood. And as number 4 Mark I production got going, they sped it up. This example here, which you've seen before, but hey, why not? It has still an adjustable, but a stamped rear sight. They would go to a kind of a sheet steel stamped trigger guard, very straight, and they would go away from the brass butt plate. Sometimes they'd use steel, sometimes kind of a Zimac alloy, like cheap things are made out of, whatever they had to do. It was wartime. Notice the bolt here. One kind of interesting fact about the number 4, these never had magazine cutoffs, but they were designed, the receiver was designed in such a way that they could add it later if they so chose. There's a little bump here, a little where it could be machined out to put it in there in front of the bolt. And notice the spring-loaded bolt release catch on the number 4 Mark I. Now, early ones had these nicely ribbed upper handguards. Actually, with some of the trials guns, they were even checkered. And initially, the barrel bands here were machined. But, well, the war wasn't kind, and the UK would continue to make some shortcuts. But there really wasn't anything compared with what happened in North America. Needing all the small arms they could get, and realizing that a whole army equipped with Sten guns was a horrible idea. Production was started in Canada at Long Branch, and a contract was signed with Savage in the USA, and interestingly enough, using part of the old Stevens plant. Now, initially, they were going to produce the No. 4 Mark I, but a new pattern was created in England and accepted, known as the No. 4 Mark I Star. And it had one major simplification. The little spring-loaded catch to retain the bolt and remove it was simply deleted. And to replace it, all they did was cut out a little notch in the receiver. That was the difference between the Mark I and the Mark I Star. But Canada and Savage, but really Canada, would introduce other changes. This one has the stamped type barrel bands. This is the machined ones here. You can tell because they have kind of more of a rounded edge. These are very straight steel, and it has kind of this unique front sight. Anyway, cheap as they could do. They also tried cheapening up the rifling. But mechanically, everything here is the same as the Enfield's always had. 10-round mag, and the trigger is hung from the trigger guard, a part of this. Same type of bolt system with removable rotating head, rear locking lugs, topped off by chargers. You know the drill. And that's kind of how things would remain up until about 1944, when the war was firmly turning in the tide of the Allies. For one thing, the contract with Savage was canceled that summer, right around the time right after D-Day. So Savage would wrap up the guns they were already building and call it a day, having turned out around 1,200,000. Long Branch would continue until 1945 and halt production. Although interestingly, they would start it up again briefly for a couple of years in 1949-1950, bringing their total up to nearly 1 million, about 900 to 950,000. And of course, several more were produced in the UK. Now, the No. 5 was supposed to fully replace the No. 4, but as I talked about in the No. 5 video, things didn't really work out as anticipated. Thus, it kind of fell back on the No. 4. And that is why we ended up with the Mark II. In the UK, one of the first things they did, actually even before the end of the war, they went back to the brass butt plate. It's worth pointing out the brass butt plate was actually cast brass, not machined as such. It's fine, it's a butt plate. It does butt plate things. They also went away from using more stamp parts and back to more machined parts, although not always. For example, they stuck with the stamped barrel bands because, why not? They also did a few more niceties. But after the war, in 1946, they identified a problem. That pesky trigger. When they were using the walnut furniture, it wasn't a problem. Walnut was stable, especially when it naturally cured. But when they started using birch, or even beech wood, that was accelerated in a kiln to dry out and cure, it wasn't as stable, especially after time in the field. And that meant it would impact the trigger and the sear, giving kind of wonky trigger pulls, sticking triggers, things of that nature. And they wanted to give it a fix. It took them some time. I think, again, they were still kind of trying to figure out how to make the No. 5 Mark I work. When that really didn't pan out, they said, okay, let's get to it serious. And in July of 1949, the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark II went into production at Verzakerley. Now, BSA had already stopped production in 1947. Really, Verzakerley was the only one left still even remotely interested in Enfields at that time. Now, I wanted to talk about these because that No. 4 Mark I II. They had plenty of Mark I's from World War II. Some of them just needed some TLC, some of them just needed the update, and so the I/2, that was an updated Mark I to Mark II standard. And we can see some differences here. Again, they all got the brass butt plate. You can also see this one has the kind of hollowed out bolt handle, although some No. 4 Mark I's had that as well. This one has the original, just simplified bolt. But the major difference is our trigger. Now, they had to redo the receiver a bit and the trigger guard because they hung the trigger from the receiver to give it stability and did not interfere with the wood. An easy way to tell, on the original ones, there's this kind of squared off cutout in the stock with a little bit of a piece of steel on the screw there. For the Mark II pattern, that is just a round hole for the screw. That's just because of the changes they had to kind of do internally. They would also replace the furniture if it was needed, so Mark II types can either appear with birch or they can have some nice beechwood. Either way. And that was really the only difference back here. There's only 3 serialized parts on a No. 4. The receiver, the bolt, and the magazine, although a lot of the times the magazine is a replacement, like a military mag, but yeah, it doesn't have a serial. So sometimes it's really just the receiver and the bolt that have a serial. Like I said, it's kind of interesting that they kept the stamped barrel bands. They went to kind of a nicer front end piece here. And for the Mark II series, they they almost always have a phosphate finish, and sometimes that's covered by Britain's patented Sunkerite black paint. So it's usually a paint over phosphate finish. Maybe not as attractive as bluing, but really good in the environments. And of course, one other thing, and this is something that happened at the end of the war, they got rid of the simplified rear sights and went back to the standard 200 to 1200 or 1300 yard adjustable micrometer sight. And the battle sight is for 300 yards. That's only elevation adjustable. The front sight here, that's drift windage adjustable. And of course they take the same, small bayonet. Not really much to see flipping these over that we haven't already seen, but I thought I'd just do it for a minute here. Of course, the receivers are going to be the same pattern because they both started off as World War II guns. Note that this one here has a very slab side appearance, whereas this one has a small step here. That's pretty common. You can also find different sizes of rear sling swivel because these were made by several factories over quite a bit of a production run. By the way, this one has the machined trigger guard. It's more rounded. This one has the more square cut, harsh guard. So with that, what about the No. 4 Mark I/3? Well, as you guessed, those were No. 4 Mark I stars, such as built in Canada and the USA. They were updated to the new Mark II standard. Please note that even though the star was developed in the UK, it was never produced in UK factories. But they had plenty of them. The Americans sure didn't need any of the Savages, and Canada was producing its own, so Britain updated to the new standard. And so there can be some interesting little variations that kind of pop up there. But mostly in just how things are machined And of course they would go away from the Canadian simplified rear sight, the machined one there, and put on the butt plate. And again, they would rehang the trigger. Usual story. And flipping over, yeah, the I3 would go away from the simplified bolt release, and it would go to the spring-loaded type, as I'm sure you could already guess, but just in case, I'd reiterate that here. Otherwise, yeah. So, the production run wasn't just new build guns. It was tons of World War II era guns that were updated to a peacetime standard, with new furniture as needed, although you can find them with original World War II furniture. Hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's not dissimilar to what Russia did in the same time period to its Mosin Nagants and SVT Tokarevs, or even what the USA did with its World War II era M1 carbines and M1 Grands. So yeah, it's not an unprecedented thing. By the way, the FTR means just that it's gone through the factory for a factory through repair, which is when any broken or replacement parts get put in, and of course the upgraded rear sight is installed. But you know, the Mark II has its own history and actually had a lot of purchasers or donators, believe it or not, and a lot were made, and there's even variations within the No.4 Mark II series. So since I'm known for being way too detail-oriented, let's talk about those. So with the No.4 Mark II, one does have to ask the question, why? Yeah, it was a little bit better than the Mark I, and certainly nicer made. The reworked trigger here is more consistent. It's not really a better pull. It has kind of a sharp break, but it's consistent, and it won't get jammed up by the wood getting all caca. These can have either a rib trigger, like the one up here, or a smooth trigger here, like the late production one. We'll say this has still kind of the bouncy Enfield trigger, whereas this one is still a little bouncy, but a little more firm. Of course, it's new, essentially, because this did come in as a mummy wrap, although, of course, it's unwrapped now. Guns and wrap are not fun. The fun about having a gun is taking it out, studying it, and shooting it. And, of course, the markings would change. And they did have customers. Over 20 different agencies, police and government, ordered these. Even though the world was awash with bolt actions following World War II, and the Enfield was respected, and the British were letting them go very cheap. Of course, a major order was the Irish contract, said to be about 50,000 pieces. Typically around 1954 is when they're said to be dated. 1955, perhaps. And there was also a major South African contract. And the Royal Air Force acquired a substantial number of Mark IIs. Many more went to India. And some went down to other African nations. And then police departments picked them up. So there was a market. And the British Army was still issuing the No.4 for the Korean War. They still hadn't gone to a self-loader yet. They would have to wait another half-decade for that. Although, I don't know that many No.4 Mark IIs actually made it to Korea. I'm sure some probably did by 1953, but typically they were going with Mark Is. But they certainly would go in English stockpiles in the early 50s as needed, although late production ones would pretty much go straight from the factory to the crate. And all in all, it was a make-work program. I think everyone can agree with that. England was in an economic slump. Yeah, they won World War II, but at a major cost. The Blitz, bombings of other types, all the materiel that it took, well, all those bills came due. and the factory needed work. The economy needed what stimulation it could have, jobs, that kind of thing. And they just weren't in a good position to adopt a new self-loading or select-fire rifle, so it all kind of came together. And on top of that, of course, Britain's empire was falling apart. India, Palestine, they were all going away, and that had a psychological toll that kind of exemplified this. I think that's why they stuck to a very classic rifle that they had had for 60 years, even if it really was well made. It's kind of interesting. I don't know exactly when in 1955 production was officially halted at Fazakerley. I can tell you that originally Fazakerley used the serial prefix PF, but around 1954 they switched to UF here. So it's one of many late changes. And I've certainly seen rifles from May of that year. It seems like production was halted around September. Another interesting thing, especially using the parts they had on hand, some of these were built expressly for the commercial and commercial export markets. By 1955, 1956, Inner Arms and others had made the U.S. market kind of viable. So some of these were essentially brand new production Enfields built for the civilian market. And you can usually tell those because they won't have all the broad arrow markings on final proofs. So yeah, looking at these, the converted Mark 1 and the factory built 2. So it's stamp bands here, slightly different wood furniture. Got the screw here for the trigger. Very nice butt plate. The little lip here to open up the trapdoor was increased, the indent, over time. It's a little smaller, gets a little bigger. Another fun fact about this gun, and one reason I always kept it, there's a screw here in the stock. I can't say for sure, but that's often attributed to India, the Ishapur factory. It said that they would install these as a reinforcing pin, because again, several No.4s were sent to India after the breakup of the empire, and of course Ishapur made their own. By the way, just in case you were wondering, in 1944, that's when they switched from using the Roman numeral after the mark to the Arabic numeral, so it is correctly I and 2 for these. On this side, you can also see a little bit of a difference in the cut of the receiver. Nothing major. This one has a much more even finish, whereas this one is more of the Sunkarati type. This one definitely, I think, went to India. Just has that vibe to it. But there's a couple of other differences on the other side. One you probably already noticed. The bolt handle knob is the hollow type here on the refurbished one. But on the new production one from 55, it is a perfectly round ball. And this is the only No.4 I can think of. Although, maybe I'm sure some war times had this. But most of them have kind of that flat surface. This is the ball type. I always thought that was interesting. And that jumps out at you when you get to details. One that doesn't is here. Remember that bulge I talked about that they kept in the receiver in case they ever wanted to install a magazine cutoff? It's been on all No.4s up until 1954 and into 55, when it was finally removed with the No.4 Mark 2. It's just flat here. And you kind of wonder, why are they changing things now? That would make no sense. Well, another gun that doesn't have that was the Jungle Carbine, the No.5, which entered into production in 1944 and ran through the end of 1947. In the case of the carbine, they removed that piece along with a few others to streamline and kind of take ounces off. Now, I don't think, this is just my theory, I don't think they intentionally set out to do that for the Mark II receiver. I think since the number 5 was kind of prematurely canceled, Fazakerly, who had been the last producer of the Jungle Carbine, just had these receiver forgings in inventory. And they just said, hey, we're getting to the end of production, let's use them. So the last number 4 Mark IIs are actually built on number 5 Mark I Jungle Carbine receivers. But again, I don't think it was so much that they intentionally did this as it was just a side effect of kind of ending production. The same thing kind of goes with this ball knob. If you look at the Jungle Carbine, it's like they just took the cocking knob from it and never machined out the hole, the cut. It's the little things like that that I really find interesting. And that's kind of what's interesting about these last production ones. Like this has the smooth trigger. They can be, while the finish on them is very nice, pretty wood, you can tell they skip some machining steps for some of the small parts where it absolutely wouldn't matter. And they don't have as many proofs and symbols and whatnot on them as you might expect from other Enfields. But at any rate, by the autumn of 1955, production was over. They would continue to ship these for a while. Ireland would get some, including the constabulary, and others would never leave England until they were sent to the America zone in the 80s and 90s and what have you, which is, again, what the story with this one is. But they did get around. Interestingly, in Pakistan, POF, Pakistan Ordnance Factories, which was actually started, well, its beginning was helped out by the UK. They tried their hand at producing a number 4, which looks very much like the Mark II. I don't think they made very many, but they did dabble. And again, several like this one, in my theory, went over to Ishapur. And finally, of course, as you know, Canada, Australia, and England, and even South Africa would all replace this rifle in the late 50s and early 60s with the FNFAL/L1A1. But I just really like Enfields, and the Mark II is often just lumped in with the Mark I, and it really isn't. It really is a neat thing that they were still tweaking the design 60 years after its creation. So what do you think? And let's wrap up with them all laid out. Got the number 4 Mark I on top, then the number 4 Mark I star, then the number 4 Mark I-2, and finally the true blue number 4 Mark II, very late production. From the very outset, the number 4 was meant to be easy to mass produce, inexpensive, because the original Enfield was a bit time consuming. And of course, with the war, they found more and more ways to speed things up. And then at the end of the war, running through the 40s and 50s, they found ways to make it a little more elegant. I don't know exactly how many number 4 Mark IIs were built, but if you count the refurbished guns and the new production, the closest figure I've come across is around 1 million. Which sounds like a lot, and it was, but again, remember, a lot of them were refurbished World War II guns. And if you consider the one Irish contract was supposed to be 50,000 pieces, and they had 10, 20 contracts, yeah, that tracks. May not be quite 1 million, but, you know, Savage was able to produce more than that in just a 3-year production run. This is what made surplus collecting so cool back in the day. And the 303 cartridge is a lot of fun, even though it's an old school rimmed round. These, by the way, were meant for the World War II Mark VII ball. And of course they took the socket bayonet, either the pig sticker or the short blade type. And of course they had the standard Enfield sling that they've been using since World War I. And they kept the same rope and oiler in the buttstock. And many of these were used as police guns, guard guns, cadet guns, training guns, or even like airfield type guns for the RAF well throughout the 1960s, even into the 70s and 80s in some places, again like Ireland, and for that matter, India. So they had a role to play. And heck, they were still used in Canada for like wildlife protection and all that. They probably still are to this day. It's still a very fast action 10-shot magazine. This has a 29-inch sight radius, aperture sights. The barrel is about 25¼ inches long. It's nominally free-floated. And with these late production guns, the quality of everything is just top-notch. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, at least some. Hey, if you're sick or bored or trying to get to sleep, it'd be a good way to get that going. I just wanted to show these to you while I had access to all of them. This one came in through that friend of mine that I got the other jungle from, and actually it is already sold at the store, so it will be heading out tomorrow. It's a nice gun, even better condition than this one, but I like this gun. It has character. I like the screw thrown in it. I like that it does have the packing swivel, the piling swivel for the TP in it. A lot of them don't. And I like the really thick black paint it has. I don't know. Can't keep them all. And sorry I don't have a Savage to show you. I decided a long time ago I'd rather have a long branch. Ironically, my first No.4 I ever bought 20 some odd years ago was a Savage. Interestingly, someone took literally a magic marker and tried to make a tiger striped stock set. It's as amazing as you can imagine. I don't know. I just love Enfields. And when I got into gun buying and collecting, and even shooting, these were a very affordable, fun thing to do with a lot of history. In fact, way back when, my father even deer hunted with a .303 Enfield, sporterized, of course, because Arkansas, for many years. They were always kind of well regarded, even back in the 50s and 60s. Maybe not as well regarded as good old American guns, but, you know, the British were our allies, so they were kind of viewed as quaint but effective. Certainly viewed as better than a Carcano or one of those crappy Arisakas. Again, I'm talking about perception in the 1950s. And there weren't enough Russian guns around back then to even really make an impact. But at any rate, because I could, I wanted to do a thorough video on this often overlooked variant, especially considering I recently did do that one on the Jungle Carbine. So I'd love to hear about your own Enfields in the comments. Please feel free to share. And always, if you'd like to help support the channel as we move into the fall and better shooting weather, check out the link to our Patreon page. You can pledge support there. And if you can't do that, perfectly understand. Just liking, sharing, subscribing, all that good stuff is wonderful in and of itself. With that, I wish you a good evening. This is Misha, and I'll catch you with probably more of an action-packed video very soon next time.